All right, so we're back, and you know what that means, right?
Time for another deep dive?
You got it. And this time, well, let's just say things are getting pretty heated in Washington. We're talking Trump's second-term cabinet confirmations.
Yeah, January 2025, Trump back in the White House, and the Senate is, well, it's a bit of a battlefield right now as his picks face, all that scrutiny.
Oh, yeah. And to really get a feel for this whole thing, we've gone deep, like really deep into the media landscape.
We're talking Fox News, of course.
Naturally.
But also, we've got some fiery commentary from Badlands Media.
Ooh, always a good time.
And then some insights from The Charlie Kirk Show. And we even dove into some legal analyses from the American Center for Law and Justice.
Oh, and don't forget the polls. We got to see what the public thinks about all this.
Absolutely. Public opinion matters.
So are you ready to unpack this whole confirmation whirlwind?
I'm ready. Let's see what this tells us about, where we are politically and the power of media. This whole thing, it's fascinating.
Right. It's not just who's getting the job. It's ideology, power, the future, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's introduce our players, right? Trump's brought some familiar faces to the table. We're talking Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary.
Interesting choice.
Kristi Noem for Homeland Security.
Right.
Pam Bondi wants that Attorney General spot.
Makes sense.
And then there's Marco Rubio aiming for Secretary of State.
He's been around the block a few times.
Oh, yeah. And we can't forget John Ratcliffe for CIA Director.
Oh, right.
Sean Duffy heading for Transportation.
Okay.
Chris Wright over at Energy, and then Russell Vought for OMB Director. And get this, every single one of these nominees, they've already had to face those Senate committees for their confirmation hearings.
So we're dealing with the real deal here.
Exactly. No more speculation. And let me tell you, those hearings, they haven't exactly been peaceful tea parties.
Ooh.
Just take Pete Hegseth's confirmation hearing for Defense Secretary, for example. The Democrats have really come out swinging.
Yeah, they've definitely been vocal about their opposition.
I mean, we're talking accusations of sexual misconduct from his past, criticism of his, whole stance on diversity in the military. And some people haven't been exactly shy about questioning his qualifications.
I remember Senator Tammy Duckworth. She's a veteran herself, right?
Right.
She went so far as to say Hegseth wasn't even qualified to run an Applebee's, let alone the whole Department of Defense.
An Applebee's? I mean, ouch. So what's fueling all this opposition?
Well, if we look past those, those attention-grabbing headlines, you start to see that Hegseth represents a specific type of conservative thought that's been gaining traction lately.
Interesting.
It's this brand of conservatism that really emphasizes, like, a strong military on the global stage, going back to what they consider, traditional values.
Okay.
And they're pretty skeptical of what some people call, quote-unquote, woke policies.
Right.
So his nomination, it's a pretty clear sign that Trump wants to reshape the military to fit this vision,
A vision that's not exactly shared by everyone.
Not exactly.
And of course, the Republicans, well, they're pushing back against all these criticisms pretty hard.
Makes sense.
Like Congressman Rich McCormick, he's a big Trump supporter, right?
Yeah, definitely.
He was really passionate when he spoke up for Hegseth,
Okay.
emphasizing Hegseth's military experience and praising, his commitment to realism over idealism.
That's a pretty loaded phrase these days.
It really is. But what does it even mean in this context?
I think it's about prioritizing what they see as, like, practical strength, national security interests, and putting those ahead of what they might consider, like, idealistic social agendas.
So it's less about Hegseth's actual qualifications and more about...
It's a clash of ideologies, right? Like a battle for the soul of the military, almost.
Exactly. And this clash, it gets even more heated when you look at Pam Bondi's nomination for Attorney General. She had, 2 rounds of hearings, seriously intense hearings, before that Senate Judiciary Committee.
I can only imagine.
And all the right-leaning sources we've been looking at, they're basically framing her as the one to come in and fix a corrupt Department of Justice.
It seems like there's this deep mistrust of how the previous administration handled the DOJ. They want someone to come in and clean house.
Right, like a warrior against corruption or something.
And there's this one detail that I found really striking. The American Center for Law and Justice, they reported that Bondi's second hearing, it actually got interrupted by protesters.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It just fuels this whole narrative of this battle against a rigged system,
It's a powerful image for sure. But speaking of contrast, have you noticed how Marco Rubio's confirmation process for Secretary of State seems to be, well, a lot smoother?
Yeah, it's pretty quiet compared to all the drama with Hegseth and Bondi.
Right. It's like everyone just expects him to be confirmed. Maybe there's some bipartisan agreement on foreign policy.
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely an interesting observation.
It is. So we've got heated confirmation battles, a potential fixer for the DOJ, and a seemingly smooth path for Rubio. What's the big picture here? What's this telling us about, the political scene right now?
Inside the Numbers,
Yeah.
that political analysis blog, they're saying that Trump's nominees are basically steamrolling the Senate Democrats in these hearings.
That's quite a statement.
It is. It seems like he's taking a much more, I don't know, aggressive approach compared to his first term. Like he's not holding back this time.
Yeah, no kidding. And the way the media is covering all of this, it's fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. Like take Fox News, they're playing it as, a big victory for Trump and his nominees. Like it's a clear mandate from the people.
But then you have Badlands Media, and they're going for that, more combative stance. Like these confirmations are a war against the establishment. They even bring up this deep state idea working against Trump.
Right. And that deep state narrative, it pops up a lot in some of the right-leaning sources we've been looking at.
Yeah. Like this secret network hidden within the government actively trying to sabotage Trump. It's almost like something out of a spy movie.
Right. But is there any actual evidence to support this? Or is it more of a way to, explain events through a certain lens?
A good question, and one we'll definitely be exploring further, so stay tuned. So it's less about like hard proof and more about how they see things, like a way to explain why things aren't going the way they want.
Exactly. And this whole perception, it's fueled by this, deep distrust of government institutions and this belief that power is really in the hands of just a few people operating in the shadows.
It's interesting how that narrative ties into this broader, populism and anti-establishment feeling. It's like they're saying we, the people, are being manipulated by these unseen forces.
Right. And that message can be really powerful, especially for people who feel like, their voices aren't being heard or that the system is rigged against them. It's like us versus them, right?
Yeah. Trump and his supporters on one side, this shadowy deep state on the other. And it seems like the media plays a big role in making that narrative louder. Outlets like Badlands Media, they really tap into that distrust, that anger. They present these confirmations as a fight against these unseen forces.
They use really strong language, talking about exposing the deep state, making Trump look like this lone warrior fighting against like a corrupt system. It can be really effective in getting people riled up and ready to take action.
But it also makes you think about, the potential for things to get even more divided, maybe even violent. Like, if people really believe there's this secret group working against them, it could justify some pretty extreme actions.
It's a dangerous path to go down, for
Yeah.
sure. And it's important to keep in mind that even though a lot of people really believe this stuff, there's no hard evidence.
Okay, so we've talked about this whole deep state thing, but let's shift gears a little. What about the real world effects of these confirmations? Like, if someone is listening to this and they're worried about the future of the military, what kind of changes could they expect to see if Hegseth becomes defense secretary?
Well, based on, what he's said in the past, the support he's gotten from people like Congressman McCormick, it seems likely that he'd push for more, assertive military presence globally.
Okay, I'm following.
More defense spending, a bigger focus on projecting American power, maybe even a more interventionist approach to foreign policy.
So overall, a more hawkish stance.
Yeah, you could say that.
And what about, like, the internal dynamics of the military? What could change there?
Well, Hegseth has been pretty critical of, what he calls woke policies in the military. So we might see some diversity and inclusion initiatives rolled back, less emphasis on things like sensitivity training, maybe a return to a more traditional hierarchical structure.
It sounds like there could be some big cultural shifts, too. What about Pam Bondi? If she takes over the Department of Justice, what could that look like?
A lot of the right-leaning sources we've seen, they're really pushing this idea that she's going to clean house at the DOJ.
Right.
They see her as like a tough prosecutor, someone who'll restore law and order.
But what does that mean, practically speaking? What changes could we see in, like, Legal priorities, prosecutions.
It's possible we see a renewed focus on certain types of crime, maybe a tougher approach to things like drug enforcement, immigration. We might also see sentencing guidelines change, maybe a push for longer sentences.
And it's likely that there will be investigations, maybe even prosecutions, targeting people and policies from the previous administration. A lot of people on the right are calling for that.
Definitely. And that would almost certainly lead to some major legal battles and even more political division.
Okay, so we've got a potential shakeup at the Pentagon, maybe a new direction at the DOJ, and then there's Marco Rubio. His confirmation seems to be going pretty smoothly. Think that means we might actually see some bipartisan cooperation in foreign policy?
It's definitely possible. Rubio's generally seen as a more, moderate voice in the Republican Party, but even if he is confirmed, he'll still be working within a Trump administration.
Right. At the end of the day, Trump's the one making the calls. So even if there is some cooperation, we could still see a pretty big shift in America's diplomatic approach under a second Trump term.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Trump's been, well, unpredictable, you could say, when it comes to foreign policy. He doesn't shy away from going against the grain.
That's one way to put it.
So even if there's some common ground, it's probably safe to say that America's role in the world could look very different if Trump gets a second term. And let's not forget about all those other nominees, even though they might not be getting as much media attention. We've got John Ratcliffe for CIA Director, Sean Duffy for Transportation, Chris Wright for Energy, Russell Vought for OMB Director. These are all important positions that could have a big impact.
They really are. It's not just about personalities. It's about setting the direction for these whole government agencies, influencing policies that will affect millions of people.
It's like every confirmation has the potential to trigger a chain reaction, changing everything from national security to energy to the economy.
And remember, this is just the start. Once these nominees are in, that's when the real work begins. They have to put Trump's agenda into action, deal with all the political maneuvering, and make decisions that will have real consequences.
It's a big job, and I think it's safe to say the next 4 years will be anything but predictable. So we've talked about a lot, right?
Yeah, we have.
The confirmation battles, this whole deep state idea, the possible policy changes. But what does it all mean for the average person?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to get lost in all the political drama and the media hype, but what matters is how these confirmations will actually affect people's lives.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, for sure. But let's try to, make this a bit more relatable. Like, say you're a parent listening to this, and you're a little worried about your kid, joining the military someday. How could these confirmations change things for them?
Well, if Hexas takes over at the Pentagon, you might see the types of military careers they emphasize change. Maybe they focus more on combat roles and less on, support positions, technical stuff, or the culture might shift, become less focused on diversity and inclusion, and that could affect how your kid feels about belonging, their opportunities to move up in the ranks.
So even these decisions that seem, I don't know, really far removed from our daily lives, they can actually have a real impact on a personal level.
For sure.
What about someone who's worried about the legal system? Like they're concerned about things like criminal justice reform, civil liberties, all that. How could Bondi, as head of the DOJ, affect them?
If you're concerned about those things, Bondi's appointment, it could mean things shift towards a more, law and order approach. We might see them roll back some of those criminal justice reforms that have happened recently, and maybe less emphasis on protecting civil liberties, especially if they think those liberties clash with national security.
So it sounds like it really matters to pay attention to these confirmations, even if you don't think they'll affect you directly. They can really change the direction of the country.
Absolutely. And it's not just those big positions like, defense secretary, attorney general. Remember the other nominees we talked about. Ratcliffe at the CIA, Duffy at transportation, Wright for energy, Vought at OMB. Their decisions affect everything. Intelligence gathering, infrastructure, how our taxes are used.
It's like this huge web of, interconnected decisions, policies, and these confirmations. They're tugging on some pretty important threads. So what can we even do? If we're worried about where things are headed, how can we make our voices heard?
I mean, the most obvious thing is to vote. Make sure you're registered and you vote in every election, from local all the way up to national. And, reach out to your elected officials. Tell them what you're thinking, what you're worried about. Support groups that share your values. Talk to your friends and family about this stuff. Have real conversations.
So it's about being an active citizen, not just, sitting back and watching. And staying informed, like what you're doing right now, listening to this deep dive. That's a huge part of it.
Exactly. Knowing what's going on, that's power.
Hmm,
The more you understand the issues, the people making these decisions that affect your life, the better you can make your voice heard, push for change.
I like that. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. We've talked about the nominees, the potential policy changes, but I keep thinking about this deep state idea, how it reflects this, deeper feeling of distrust in the government. Like people are disillusioned.
Yeah, it's a big trend, and it goes beyond just Trump. A lot of Americans feel like the system is rigged, that their voices don't count, that the people in charge don't really care about what's best for them.
And that feeling of being ignored, powerless, it can be really dangerous. It can make people apathetic, make them withdraw, or worse, it can push them towards extremism, violence.
We need to find ways to fix this division, get people to trust our institutions again. We need to have these open, honest conversations about the problems we're facing and work together to find solutions that help everyone.
That's a good point. It's easy to focus on the negative, the partisan fighting, but we have to remember we're all in this together. We need to find ways to work together to build a better future.
Absolutely. We should all keep that in mind as we deal with this crazy, ever-changing political landscape.
This has been quite the journey, right? We've gone through the confirmation battles, that whole deep state idea, what these appointments could mean for policy. Hopefully you're walking away feeling more informed, engaged, maybe even a little inspired to do something.
Don't forget, this is just a snapshot. The story's still going, and we'll be here to help you make sense of it all.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay involved. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.